Last week, we took a short detour into the CBI theatre to cover some new developments on this front, including the start of the first Arakan campaign. But today, we return to our two main theatres of the war as of now, New Guinea and Guadalcanal. In the first one, we'll resume our coverage of the bloody Battle of Bunagona, as the Americans and Australians finally join forces to take on the Buna defenders, and on the latter, the recent defeats of the Japanese Empire against the tenacious Allied soldiers finally forced their leaders to take a drastic decision that would decisively change the future of the war. With this in mind, join us as we delve into another exciting episode of the Pacific War. Hey history fans, quick channel update before we jump to the video. As we've said previously, most of the money earned by this channel is being reinvested into more better researched and better made videos, as well as our Wizards and Warriors and Cold War channels. We prefer to rely on our kind patrons and YouTube members, and not sponsors. No one likes excessive sponsorships. However, right now having sponsors is a necessity. Still, we vow that as soon as we get to 10,000 patrons and YouTube members, we'll stop adding sponsorships to our videos. We have a great team and we want to be able to continue paying them living or competitive wages and not cut back on production. So until the algorithm is more favorable and we can release more than 3 videos per week, extra videos that our team has created will be posted as YouTube member and Patreon exclusives. 1 or 2 videos per week will be exclusively available for our YouTube members and patrons, whose ranks you can join by pressing the button below the video or becoming a patron via the link in the description. Don't worry though, these videos will not be from one of the ongoing series and will be either standalone episodes or belong to a new series. For just $5 you can support our work, watch exclusive videos, there are 10 now and more are added every week, get early access to free videos, learn our schedule, get access to our private Discord, watch our behind the scenes videos, and much more. Thank you for watching and for your kind support. We wouldn't be able to do what we love without you. Two weeks ago, we left the Guadalcanal campaign as the Americans launched a new offensive against the Japanese positions to the west, an offensive that ended inconclusively with the fierce Gifu defenders surrounded by the battered and exhausted 132nd Regiment. But while this was happening, important events and decisions were unfolding in Japan. We'll recall that their efforts to supply and land more reinforcements in this island of death had become increasingly difficult in the last few months, as the Cactus Air Force finally established air superiority over the Solomons, and as the Allied Navy proved itself determined to stop the Japanese express runs with whatever means necessary. With the IJN now shifting their focus to the defense of New Guinea, Navy officials hoped to convince their army analogues to do the same, with a negative response promising to corrode future inter-service relations between them. We all know by now the deplorable conditions that the IJA soldiers were enduring on Guadalcanal. The starvation, the diseases, the living conditions inside their well-concealed bunkers. But despite these, through November, the conventional view in Tokyo remained that Japan could still triumph if air superiority was regained over the Solomons. This was because of the value of its airfield, its symbolism and prestige as the objective of the first Allied counter-offensive, and because it was feared that extricating the 30,000 men on the island would be more costly than launching another assault. By December, however, the Guadalcanal campaign had consumed so many of Japan's reserves that its war economy would be severely distorted in order to provide the shipping resources for future operations. As the days went by, and more reports from the front lines about the abysmal state of the forces at Guadalcanal reached headquarters, heated debates in extreme secrecy ran simultaneously at Rabaul and Tokyo. Although Generals Imamura and Hyakutake had been planning to land the 51st Division at Guadalcanal for a 4th offensive, that division was finally redirected to reinforce the Buna defenders on December 12th, something that already hinted that the withdrawal the IJN was planning was an actual possibility. Soon, as 8th Area Army officers started to learn about the precipitous decline of the Navy's air, destroyer and submarine forces, and about the lack of confidence among local leaders for a renewed offensive, they finally had to give in and submit a report to Tokyo on December 25th, advising an immediate withdrawal. To their surprise, the proposal to withdraw elicited no objection, so the planning of Operation KE began in earnest. For this, the IJA managed to convince the reluctant navy to utilize the maximum feasible number of warships for the evacuation, rather than just barges and small craft. Imamura himself spoke plainly that he would not abandon the men on Guadalcanal and that he would strive to evacuate as many as possible. Another aspect to be discussed was where to set up the new defensive line to contain the American drive through the Solomons. By December 31st, it was decided that the IJN would take responsibility for the defense of the New Georgia to Santa Isabel area, while the army would hold the Northern Solomons. Thus, Operation KE, the withdrawal from Guadalcanal, was finally scheduled to start by mid-January 1943. Now moving on to Buna. We left General Eichelberger's 32nd Division as it was about to be reinforced by some much-needed Australian forces. By December 15th, a battalion of the 18th Brigade and a squadron of 8 M3 General Stuart tanks had landed at Oro Bay under the overall command of Brigadier George Wotton. They were to take over the sector of Warren Force, with the mission of clearing the Dorapa Plantation, New Strip and Old Strip areas. As we've seen, the intrusion of tanks into this front was something that had been largely sought by the American command, and now the ex-squadron of Captain Norman Whitehead, which consisted of highly trained crews of the 2nd 6th Armoured Regiment, was about to make its presence felt at Buna. With the 2nd 10th Battalion getting ready to arrive by December 18th, and with the 3 American battalions of Warren Force assigned to his command, Wotton planned to launch a first assault with the experienced 2nd 9th Battalion, hoping to capture Cape Ndiaidere to establish a line running from the east end of New Strip to the west end of Old Strip. This attack would be supported by 7 of Whitehead's tanks, aircraft, artillery and American mortars. Though the weather ended up preventing aircraft from assisting the attack, the artillery commenced its bombardment at 0650 on December 18th, and the Australians finally launched their fierce assault 10 minutes later. The tanks spearheaded the advance into the Japanese strongpoints, with the 3 companies of the 2nd 9th Battalion moving close behind them. Despite the tenacious defense of the surprised Japanese from their well-concealed bunkers, Whitehead's tanks rapidly started to batter post after post, the infantry closing in behind them to hurl their grenades through these small openings to finish off the fanatic defenders. Although the push through the Dorapa Plantation proved more difficult than the attack up the coast, by the end of the day, Wotton's men would successfully advance to a line 400 yards west of Cape Ndiaidere that ran from the east of New Strip to the sea. Yet the fierce Japanese also inflicted considerable losses on them, destroying 2 tanks and badly wounding both Whitehead and Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hodgson, the commander of the 2nd 6th Armoured Regiment. The following day, the Australians would clean up the area they had taken as they adjusted their line, while at the same time, the American forces would mop up the captured territory and would also move west to support the attack against the New Strip. Meanwhile, with his defensive line completely broken, Colonel Yamamoto had to order the 229th Regiment's men to execute a fighting withdrawal back to the government station, with the soldiers immediately pulling back to bunkers near the Samemi Bridge and the foul swamp into which the creek merged. On December 20th, Wotton's attack would at last resume, with the objective of securing the mouth of the Samemi Creek. Supported by a strong air bombardment and reinforced with 1 company of the 2nd 10th, the Australians would again overrun a large amount of Japanese positions, successfully pushing west towards Strip Point. Past this point, however, the attackers would have to push across 2 clearly marked patches of kunai, a treacherous terrain that proved to be too much for the tanks. 2 of them were bogged so deep that they were held fast, and only the beach now offered any chance of getting the tanks forward. Thus, the Australians would have to continue without their valuable tank support, suffering many more losses against the enemy mortars and snipers. By nightfall, the Japanese had withdrawn across the Samemi Creek to establish new defensive positions at its crossing points. The Australians had established a perimeter halfway between Strip Point and the creek, and the Americans had occupied the New Strip area to join their comrades against the enemy line. In the meantime, General Eichelberger was finally planning to launch his attack on the government station by securing a foothold on the government gardens. On the night of December 21st, a company of the 3rd Battalion 127th Regiment thus crossed Entrance Creek amidst heavy yet inaccurate fire by the alert defenders, and then secured a landing to cover the passage of a 2nd company the following day. Immediately, American engineers set out to construct a bridgehead through which 3 more companies of the 127th Regiment would move forward on December 24th. At the same time, taking advantage of how stretched thin the enemy SNLF Marines were while fighting at the 2 fronts, a strong patrol of the 3rd Battalion had crossed into Mesita on the afternoon of December 22nd, traversing the island from west to east largely unopposed and successfully securing the government station bridge by December 23rd. Now, the Americans were finally ready to launch their renewed offensive. But first, we have to return to Brigadier Wotton's front. Unable to cross the Samemi Creek against the fortified enemy positions, on December 21st, Wotton ordered Warren Force and the 2nd 10th Battalion to search the creek for alternative crossing places. With strong determination, the Australians quickly discovered that it might be possible to cross the creek where it twisted itself into a U-bend, a short distance northeast of the lower end of Old Strip. A company was sent to check this avenue, and to their surprise, they would successfully cross the creek and find themselves in the Old Strip after establishing the bridgehead. By December 23rd, as the 2nd 9th Battalion completed the capture of the eastern bank of the creek at a high cost, the 2nd 10th had crossed into the Old Strip and was ready to face the enemy on the bridge. The Japanese there actually considered the swamps and the creek in their rear to be impassable, so they were completely surprised when the Australian forces fell upon them, forcing them to finally abandon the sites which had defied the Americans for so long. By the end of the day, Warren Force had at last crossed the bridge, and the 2nd 10th had made tremendous progress along the Old Strip. Supported by 4 tanks, the Allied forces then continued their advance along the Old Strip on December 24th, and although the last tanks at Wotton's disposal would be rapidly destroyed by a concealed anti-aircraft gun, the Australian shock troopers fiercely broke through the Japanese defences, successfully advancing about 700 yards on the right flank as the Americans mopped up the ground behind them. With the eastern sector's defences completely broken, the Japanese now had to carry out a fighting rearguard to disguise Yamamoto's withdrawal to Goropa Plantation. This rearguard was ordered to fight to the bitter end, and as they desperately tossed grenades out of their foxholes at the advancing Allied forces, they would successfully delay the attackers and inflict many casualties on them. Thus, for the next few days, Wotton's forces would slowly attempt a costly infiltration to overrun the remaining Japanese fortifications, consolidating their position on the Old Strip by December 27th as the defenders began to yield against the tenacity of the attackers. Without tank support, the Allied soldiers would also suffer many casualties, but they would then be luckily reinforced by more artillery and 12 new tanks. On December 28th, a new attack would be launched, with each flank trying to squeeze the Japanese against Goropa Creek. But after a day of bloody skirmishes and local forays, not much progress would be made. Even worse, during the night, the desperate defenders launched a series of surprise counterattacks and raids against the attackers, inflicting even more casualties on the Allied forces. The following day, Wotton planned to launch another attack, this time supported by 4 of the newly arrived tanks. Yet the tanks would advance too quickly ahead of the infantry, rapidly overrunning an abandoned line of bunkers and immediately continuing on to the second line. While the tanks moved forward, the Japanese filtered back to the front bunkers in time to subject the advancing troops to intense fire when they arrived, inflicting heavy casualties on them and forcing the Allies to stop their attack. In any case, the success of that resistance would be short-lived. Now, however, we need to return to the Urbana front. On December 24th, Eichelberger and Colonel Groves finally ordered the 3 companies of the 3rd Battalion to commence its advance. Yet the tall and coarse kunai that concealed the enemy bunkers made their movement sluggish, and the viciously effective fire from hidden positions distorted the strength and purpose of the American companies. By the end of the day, the attackers had suffered many casualties, with only some small progress achieved on the right and centre to show for it. On Christmas Day, as the 1st Battalion 127th Regiment began to arrive at the front, Groves attempted another assault with all his companies, but yet again it would face the same stiff resistance. This time, however, 2 companies on the left would manage to establish a perimeter about 300 yards from the sea and 600 yards below the government station. Yet the Japanese rapidly recovered from their surprise, and with great ferocity, they encircled and isolated the American companies. In the next couple of days, Groves would repeatedly attempt to drive a corridor through from the left front to the beleaguered men, but the tenacious SNLF Marines would stop them each time. Finally, on the morning of December 27th, as one company spent the day drilling into the Japanese swamp positions on the left, another company began to edge closer and closer to the American pocket until it finally got through in the afternoon. Once this was achieved, Captain Yasuda realized at last that the triangle was being completely outflanked, so he decided to order its evacuation. At this point, however, reports abounded that the American soldiers were suffering from battle shock and had become incapable of advance. But on December 28th, the American forces unexpectedly consolidated their corridor to the forward positions, and much progress would thus be achieved on the right and centre. Although the Japanese were continuously mounting counterattacks with hand-to-hand combat, such as on Mesita Island, where they repelled an American attack, Yasuda's assessment was that they couldn't hold the garrison beyond the next morning. During the night, the attackers would also cautiously enter into the triangle, finding only empty bunkers and trenches strewn with abandoned arms and ammunition. As the approach through Mesita and the government gardens seemed too heavily contested, General Eichelberger began to seek an alternative approach to finally launch his assault on the government station. Luckily for him, on the night of December 29th, a patrol found that the Japanese were no longer contesting the passage between Buna village and the government station, so he immediately planned to attack through there and through Mesita Island with the 2nd Battalion 127th Regiment, while the 1st Battalion exerted more pressure from the gardens. By December 30th, Yasuda's forces numbered only 250 men, and food was scarce, so even though General Yamagata was planning to send the 170th Regiment to rescue them, Yasuda believed that they would only be able to hold out for a short time longer. The following day, the final offensive started as 2 companies crossed from Mesita, trying to draw to themselves the main enemy attention. Yet irresponsible firing alerted the Japanese before the bridgehead had been established, and the companies started to suffer heavy damage. Only the timely intervention of Colonel Groves to rally the troops would manage to avert a disaster, and the beachhead would at last be secured. Yet the Japanese, great defensive fighters as they'd proved themselves at every point along the coast, still staved off the inevitable, grudgingly yielding only a little to the pressure from the south and west. In the meantime, Brigadier Wootton at last saw his exhausted forces get relieved by the fresh 2nd 12th Battalion, managing to conduct a renewed offensive on January 1st, 1943, with 6 tanks supporting. The tanks would then quickly cut through Goropa Plantation, immediately starting to clear the beach down to the Samemi mouth, with infantry mopping up behind, albeit at a high cost in men. That same day, Eichelberger also renewed his offensive, and although the tenacious defenders continued to resist, the garrison was reaching a breaking point and starting to disintegrate. By nightfall, with the situation untenable, a general withdrawal had been decided. Swimmers would thus be seen by the Americans attempting to escape, but most of them would be cut down by the Allied fire. By mid-afternoon on January 2nd, Wootton's tanks would meet Groves's men west of Goropa Point, and 2 companies of the 127th Regiment would finally break through the bridge and capture the government station. From their bunker, both Yasuda and Yamamoto defied their orders to escape, instead choosing to meet their deaths in battle. Amidst the pandemonium, both commanders and their fierce men, who had held an overwhelming force for such a long time, would be finally annihilated. 2 days later, Colonel Yazawa would lead 250 men to advance on Tarakena, driving the small American force there away and using it as a point to pick up the few survivors that managed to escape the destruction at Buna. During this struggle, the Japanese are known to have lost a minimum of 1,390 men killed at Buna, and against them, the 18th Brigade lost 863 men since being committed on December 18th, and the 32nd Division suffered a total of 1,957 casualties. Thus came to an end the Buna front. Now only Sanananda remained. Next week we'll cover the developments transpiring on the Sanananda front during December, and we'll also return to Guadalcanal to cover the continuation of General Patch's offensive, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.